broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining the first in the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Live Chat Series. My name is Cynthia Bernardez, and I am Program Manager with the AAAS S&T Policy Fellowships. I will be your moderator for today. So the live chat series are an opportunity for you to learn more about the science policy interface, explore the varied placements and opportunities for AAAS S&T Policy Fellows, find out how the fellowship can transform your career, and ask fellow and alumni any questions you may have. Joining us on today's chat are fellows Daniel Sanchez and Maryam Zaringhalam. Maryam and Daniel are here to share your thoughts on why scientists and engineers in government. Why you, why now, why AAAS S&T Policy Fellowships, and they'll answer your questions live. So submit a question at any time by clicking in the question box and typing your question there. Let's begin with a quick overview of the S&T Policy Fellowships. The Fellowships is a year-long immersive policy experience in one of the three branches of the federal government. As a policy fellow, you are learning how to take your discipline, an area of expertise, and apply it on a broad scale to help affect policy. The fellowship is not a research or postdoc experience. What it is a professional development opportunity for you to bring STEM expertise to policy and gain a stronger understanding of how the federal government works, how policy affects science, and develop an extensive network of fellows, alumni, agency administrators, and policy thought leaders. So here's how one alumni described the fellowship experience. The fellowship provides the training that enables scientists and engineers to bridge the gap between science and policy, regardless of whether they remain in government, return to the lab, or pursue opportunities in industry following their fellowship. This invaluable knowledge and experience with the processes and priorities that drive science and technology policy provides a more holistic understanding of our nation's scientific enterprise, a relatively unique perspective. This gives the fellows an edge in the eye of many employers. So the fellowship areas. AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships are offered in all three areas of government, of the federal government. The executive branch fellowships are federal agency placements, and we award approximately 150 executive branch placements each year. Legislative branch fellowships are congressional offices or House Senate committees, or where they're held in House committees or in Senate committees. AAAS sponsors 2 legislative branch each year. However, we have partner societies who sponsor fellow placements in congressional and Senate offices. The Judicial Fellowship is at the Federal Judiciary Center, and we award 1 judicial fellowship each year. Applicants can and should consider applying to more than 1 fellowship. You can learn more about each program area, including potential host offices, by clicking the Become a Fellow link on the fellowship's website. The application cycle will open on August 1 for the 2019-20 fellowship year. The deadline to apply is November 1st, 2018. The fellowship year begins September 1 of the fellowship year and conclude and runs into August 31st of the following year. This is a full-time commitment, and all host office placements are in the Washington, D.C. area. Eligibility requirements include holding a U.S. citizenship and a doctoral degree in science and engineering. Applicants with a master's in engineering and 3 years of professional engineering experience are also eligible to apply. For the judicial branch fellowship, applicants must also have at least 3 years of post-degree professional experience. Visit the fellowship's website for complete details about program areas, eligibility, and application process. Now, let's introduce the fellows joining us today. So Maryam Zaringhalam is a current fellow at the National Institutes of Health. In her host office at the Office of Health Information Program Development at NIH, she works on policies open around science and data science training, which are central to NLM's strategic vision for the coming decade. Maryam holds a PhD in molecular biology from Rockefeller University. Daniel Sanchez is a AAAS Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow, serving in the office of Senator Michael Bennet. Daniel's work and engagement span the academic, non-governmental, and governmental sectors. He holds a PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley. So thank you for joining us today. So as a reminder, to ask Maryam or Daniel questions, click the question box to submit your question. Please keep your question short and direct it to the particular individual or the whole panel. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. So to start us off, actually, let me stay here. To start us off today, the theme for today's chat is why scientists and engineers in government. Why you, why now, why AAAS S&T policy fellowships? Can you both share your thoughts on why scientists and engineers should take a year to bring their expertise and training to the federal government? So I'll have Maryam answer that question first.
Sure. So for me, I came straight from my PhD to the fellowship, and I found myself, I found that academia was kind of pigeonholing me. It's all about knowing a lot about a very specific thing, and I have kind of broad interests all across all sorts of areas of science and policy. So I found that in academia, I was complaining a lot about how things were done in government, and realized that government was actually kind of a black box to me. I had no idea how it worked, only just like things that I had kind of learned in high school. And so because I'm a scientist, I thought what better way to figure out how things work than spend some time in government. So the fellowship is a really amazing opportunity to find out how this kind of black box works from a firsthand, hands-on perspective, which is really all about how we as scientists and engineers learn and understand the world. So I would encourage anybody who has any kind of curiosity or interest in how decisions are made and handed down to us as both citizens and scientists to get engaged and take a year or two off.
Awesome. Well, Daniel?
Sure. Well, I'd start by echoing everything Maryam said, but let me give a little bit of a unique perspective, given my background specifically in energy and climate change. I was trained as a chemical engineer and decided that pretty early on in my graduate program that really solving the kind of the tough questions around the transition of our renewable energy, or our energy system towards renewables, towards fighting the challenges of climate change, required a really broad and holistic perspective, one that doesn't just involve science and technology and engineering and building new technologies, but really understanding how those technologies are deployed by businesses and the policy context in which those technologies are commercialized and moved to market. And so simply put, I came to AAAS and I came to this fellowship to get all the training that I knew was remarkably important for the issue I cared about. That's just impossible to get in a science and engineering PhD program. There's a 2-week boot camp. It's kind of fundamentals of science for policy and policy for science. A really great refresher on the functioning and the organization of the federal government. A great opportunity to learn from your peers, many of whom have done this fellowship before. And then following that, you have 11 months in either in an executive branch placement, or in my case, a legislative branch placement, to really dive into something that you haven't had a chance to do. For me, I think being in the legislative branch, we should talk about this more, offers a really fresh perspective on kind of the whole of decision-making in policy and politics that is very different from what a scientific perspective has. And I think really integrating all of those different views and working at that interface is exactly what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. Well, since you kind of branched off a little bit, can you kind of share your experience, and I guess, Daniel, you can continue, your experience, the life of a fellow, or as a congressional fellow? Can you share your experience? And then Maryam, can you share your experience as an executive branch fellow, especially particularly at NIH? So Daniel, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So I would say that the day-to-day of being a fellow could not be farther from where I was in my academic postdoc before I began. So before I came to Washington, D.C., I was doing a postdoc on the Stanford University campus, and I would spend all day working on one problem. I would spend all day working on to make one step farther in my research plan. I think now flip that exactly on its head. Working in Congress right now, I spend about 50% of my time putting out fires. And by that, I mean looking at an issue that I've never seen before, finding out as much as I can as quickly as possible about it, and very quickly identifying maybe not what is the absolute best and correct decision, but what is the best we can do given the time and the resources that we have. And I think that's something that I was really yearning for during my research career. It's something that I find really exciting and exhilarating. And I would say that I have a really wonderful mix of long-term policy projects where I get to engage with experts, develop policy, work with stakeholders, and reach a longer-term tangible policy outcome, while also spending half of my time doing the exact opposite of that, which is doing everything as quickly as possible, maybe getting time to read a Congressional Research Service report before a meeting that I have, and then having to make a decision and make a recommendation on very limited evidence. And I think that is an important experience for everyone who wants to be involved in decision-making to have.
So Maryam, sharing your experience, and I guess in bringing back, why did you apply specifically to the congressional or executive branch? So I actually, since we're still on Daniel, you can answer that, and then we will really turn the table over to Maryam.
Sure. So I actually applied for both. I applied for the executive branch and the congressional branch, and I was lucky enough to have a choice. And one reason why I decided to choose the Congressional Branch Fellowship was because of the fast-moving pace of the legislative branch, and of the, to be completely frank, it's the ability to evaluate decisions not just through a policy and an evidence-based lens, but also through a political lens. That is something that is very foreign to most academics, and something that I've really wanted to experience during my year, and I would say that that's definitely been what's happened.
Thank you. Maryam?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with the shorter question, which is why the executive branch? So I think the executive branch, as somebody who has been a recipient of federal funding, is the one that I had interacted with the most, that I had the most questions about, that I thought that I could bring sort of my knowledge of how they worked back to my colleagues who are still in academia. So that was why the executive over the congressional. And as far as what a day looks like for me, or what my experience looks like, it's very different at the NIH, where I am surrounded by people who have scientific backgrounds. And so the projects that I've been working on are really making policy for science. And when I was in academia during the course of my PhD, I had the good fortune, said very sarcastically, to get scooped 5 times in the middle of my research. So I had a lot of really good ideas that kept getting published by other people. And so I had a lot of ideas about how do we make science more efficient, more democratic, more transparent. And the National Library of Medicine is all about doing that. Our mandate is to organize and disseminate information in a way that really democratizes the work that we're doing at the NIH and gives it back to the public in all different kinds of ways, whether it's with the research community or the clinical community or the public at large. So the work that I've been doing since I got to the National Library of Medicine was figuring out how are we thinking about data science across the NIH? And I got to do a really cool report that went across all of the NIH's 27 institutes and centers and figured out how are they defining this thing? Why is it really important to them? How, looking into the future in this age of big data, can we really harness that into making the best healthcare decisions possible? So it was a really great introduction to this entire institution, which was the major funding body for my work. And I've got to come up with ideas on how to sort of fix some of the problems, maybe, that I had experienced within academia as somebody who was in this very competitive atmosphere, trying to figure out what the heck was going on with all of my collaborators and, I guess, competitors, though I don't like to think of other scientists as being people I compete with.
Got it. Well, we have a question from our audience, and it's directed to Maryam. So can you describe a typical project for an STPF fellow at NIH, and where is the funds from? So I guess, and I'll answer the funds. Funds are typically federal funds, but if there's different areas where funding comes from for NIH, then you can kind of tackle on that question as well. So I'll repeat it. What's a typical project for an STPF fellow at NIH, and where is the fund from?
So I don't know that there is a typical project, because there are all different kinds of things that NIH does. Well, I can answer the first question first. The funding, NIH is we are both a funding institution, so we get money allocated from Congress that gets split up across NIH's 27 institutes and centers, and then we give it out to people applying for funding. And we also do our own research within we call it intramural community. So many of the institutes have their own intramural research programs that do new science, basically. And so fellows are, some people are in offices that give out funding, and so they might be involved in coming up with new programs, new funding opportunities in their given institute. So say the National Cancer Institute is interested in cancer, so they might have some sort of idea on projects or directions that should be funded, and they might work to help develop those sorts of funding opportunities and then give them out to the biomedical research community. For me, I've been working in an office that thinks about the policy and strategic plan of the National Library of Medicine, which we just announced pretty much as soon as I started. So we've been thinking about what is the direction of the library going to go in 10 years from now, beyond the things that I knew about most about the National Library of Medicine was just PubMed, but we're doing a lot of work in in data science? How do we train up the next generation of biomedical data scientists, and coming up with ideas for training programs that we should award, as well as thinking about what exactly is a data scientist. So what are the things that they have to know in order to be called one? So there's a whole range of things that we get to do as fellows that are kind of guided by our supervisors. Mine is he's very enthusiastic about my trying a bunch of different things. So there isn't really one typical project.
Well, Daniel, can you share a little bit about how you're using your science on the Hill, or if you are using your science on the Hill?
Sure. So let me spend a little bit of time on that. So I'm working for Senator Michael Bennet, who's a Democrat from the state of Colorado. And the area where I've really been engaging is around the 2018 Farm Bill, as it's called. So every 5 years or so, we reauthorize a series of programs. It's a 1,000-page bill, $1 trillion bill that sets essentially the entirety of our U.S. agricultural policy. And I was lucky enough during my PhD and in the time after it to focus on technologies that can store carbon dioxide in soils, in roots, and in trees, and in ecosystems. And there's actually been relatively little thinking done about how we can use our agricultural policy in the United States, the Farm Bill, to really make a contribution to fighting climate change. So I've done a mixture of kind of long-term and short-term projects all around the 2018 Farm Bill, and I'll be quite frank that the 2018 Farm Bill is on the Senate floor right now, and I'm looking at my phone, and we're trying to get Republicans to co-sponsor our amendments as I'm trying to also do this webinar. It's a really exciting way for me to use my expertise in technologies that can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to engage in a really fresh way and a fresh angle and a fresh perspective on agriculture and climate change policy. I think a little bit more broadly, I think there's a real opportunity to engage farmers and ranchers in fighting climate change, and it's something that my senator from a rural state, the rural state of Colorado, a member of the Agricultural Committee, is really interested in exploring. And just to say a little bit more about that, I think there are compelling technical reasons why we want agriculture to be part of a solution, but there are also compelling political reasons why we think that's a really under-engaged community in climate solutions, as well as in climate impacts. And so we're really using the Farm Bill as an opportunity to engage on climate change.
Right. This question is, I'll direct this question actually to both of you. What is some policy experience you wish you had before the fellowship? And so as you guys are thinking, I'm turning the table over to you, Maryam, to take a first stab at this question.
Policy experiences. I think maybe, I guess the best answer is to say that it's something that I wish, okay, here's why I jumped at it. I think I didn't have an appreciation of all of the different forms that policy can take until I got to interview week here at the fellowship. So I had, I think, 22 interviews across 6 or 7 different agencies, and every interview was completely different than the last one. And I think I had this idea going in that policy would just be this one thing. You sit with decision makers, you give them the science that you know or the evidence that you know, and then maybe you'll help them craft some sort of like policy or legislation or something like that. But talking to all of these different offices, I realized that there's a lot of engaging different kinds of stakeholders, people who might have different inputs, and those different communities are very different based on what agency you're in, what office you're in, whether you are looking internally into your own agency or funding programs outside of your agency. So it's really this huge diverse array of things that you can do that influence how people are interacting with science in society. So I think just getting that kind of exposure has been really nice for me and eye-opening, and has given me a way to talk to my peers in science and engineering and tell them how they can have an impact, even if they, I think everybody on this webinar should apply for the AAAS Science Policy Fellowship, but even if they don't, how they might be able to have some sort of impact, because there's just all of these different little avenues to get involved. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
That's fine. And Daniel, can you answer that question?
Sure. So I think that there are really two questions here. One is what kind of people excel as STPF fellows, and the second question is what can you do to make your application competitive? And I think we'll probably get to that second question a little bit later in the webinar. So let me say a little bit about the first, and I'll speak a little bit more broadly than Maryam. I think what I found most helpful during my PhD and during my postdoctoral training was everything that was not related to my curricular academic research. So I was lucky enough to join a club at the University of California, Berkeley, called the Berkeley Energy and Resources Collaborative. It spanned something like 7 or 8 colleges at the university, as well as maybe 20 different academic majors. And so it really brought engineers, policy students, business students, lawyers, all together to talk about energy and resource issues. And I found that the soft skills that I was able to obtain from that were remarkably important. The best way to write a concise email to someone whose time is limited, how to make your ask remarkably directly, how to do budgeting, how to think about strategy and execution. All of those experiences I find are remarkably valued for preparing you for just the day-to-day of being in a fellowship like this. I think that also that there are scientists who just are really naturally predisposed to being excellent STPF fellows and remarkably effective. They are generally extroverted, they are generally curious, they are generally okay with uncertainty, and really can work with uncertainty to drive better outcomes. And I think those are the kind of people that both excel as applicants and excel as fellows.
Thanks. And so I guess I'll give Maryam the opportunity to kind of answer that question in terms of what do you think made your application, when you applied to the fellowships, what do you think made your application stand out? And then how did grad school kind of prepare you for your, to submit your application for the fellowships?
So answering your first question, something that was hugely helpful, I think, for me, was my background and experiences in science communication. I am not an extroverted person, but I fool people into thinking that I'm one, because I practiced speaking to public audiences, even though it made me wildly uncomfortable. I remember the first time that I ever gave a public talk, it was to 10 people in a bar, and somebody came up to me afterwards and asked me if I was okay, because I looked like I was going to cry during the talk. And I just kept going, and I think learning how to communicate the things that I am interested in, the things that I am passionate about in a way that is human and approachable is an experience that maybe not everybody gets to have, because I think we do tend to be, as a community, a bit introverted, but it is fixable. And I think that the other thing that really helped me, because it's something that came up a bunch over and over in the course of my interviews, was that I started with a couple of friends a podcast called Science Soapbox, for any of you podcast fans. It's a little bit of log rolling. And the idea was, as 3 PhD students, we didn't really know what policy was, what advocacy was. But we knew people that were good at it. And so we started up a podcast to give ourselves an excuse to reach out to these people that we had no business reaching out to talk to them about what their careers looked like and how they got to be where they are. Many of them were former AAAS policy fellows. And so I think having that kind of experience and knowledge and just showing that I was a go-getter, and having that in a podcast format that people could listen to, some of the people who were interviewing me had listened to it, was really useful. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do that, even if you don't want to start a podcast. Last week, a National Science Policy Network just launched, and it's got a whole bunch of different student-run, mostly, science policy groups that have started at a grassroots level at institutions all across the country. And it's a really great way to like add that to your resume and get involved early on in your career, because it's never too early to start reaching out to policymakers and people who are working in this space of science and society. And I don't remember what the second question was.
It was in relation to, it was one question, but I think you kind of answered both questions.
Perfect.
Just in terms of, you know, how did grad school prepare you, and, you know, how did you think that your application was a success in entering the fellowships? So I think you kind of married those two questions together and answered them. Yeah. So here's one question that no one really likes to answer. So post-fellowship, do you think that you all will go to, do you think that you'll go back into academia? Do you think that you'll, you know, go into government? Where do you see yourselves, you know, post-fellowship? So Daniel, I'll let you take that one first.
Okay, well, in fact, what I'm doing post-fellowship is a little different from what I thought I'd be doing pre-fellowship. So I moved to Washington thinking that I would stay here, thinking that I would, you know, gain experience in Congress, maybe at an NGO or a think tank in energy and climate policy at the federal level, and then really spend a career in the federal government. What is actually happening now is I'm actually going back to the academy at the end of this year. So I'm lucky enough to have been offered a faculty position at my alma mater at UC Berkeley, working in environmental science and policy. And I have no doubt that my experience with AAAS may be more competitive for applying for that position. You know, I think I think a lot of people talk about policy, and very few people actually know what the act of doing policy is. And I think that's what really motivated almost all of us to come here and do this fellowship. And I'm confident that it's not the lingo, it's not the it's not even the politics. I think it's a slight understanding of the process goes a remarkably far way to really doing research and outreach that is practical and that makes an impact. So I really look forward to bringing my experiences back to sunny California with me.
So Maryam, what were your thoughts pre-fellowship, and then what are your thoughts of where you're going to go post-fellowship?
My thoughts pre-fellowship were that I don't want to be in academia, and my thoughts post-fellowship are I still don't want to be in academia. I think, again, I've been really excited and stimulated to have all of these different kinds of questions that I'm getting to ask and thinking about. And one really nice thing about my policy placement, or my fellowship placement, is that I'm in a data science office and using data science techniques to understand how we're thinking about data science. So I've really built up those sorts of data analytical skills over the course of the fellowship that I might be able to bring with me, whether I stay in government or whether I move into the sort of nonprofit advocacy space, which is a place that I'm kind of thinking about in the back of my mind. But I have another year, and the really nice thing about this fellowship is that I get to meet and talk to all of these different people who I might not have had access to, either through the network or leveraging my title as a AAAS fellow, which carries a lot of cachet and prestige with it, when I reach out to and get to do sorts of informational interviews. So the future is unknown but exciting.
Awesome. Let's see, going through the audience questions. So we talked a little bit about application and what makes a competitive application. Talked about typical projects. And we also talked about post-fellowship. So, so within your fellowship, do you all decide what projects to do within your fellowship, or was it kind of given to you? How were you able to kind of figure out what your projects would be during your fellowship? So, Daniel?
Sure. So the Congressional Fellowship interviews actually take place after orientation. So you show up, you move to Washington, D.C., and you don't know where or for whom you'll be working. So that's both committees and members. And the 22 interviews that Maryam mentioned, we have a very similar process compressed into 3 days. Only it happens a week before you start rather than 5 months before you start. When I was interviewing, there were a lot of options that really appealed to me. You know, positions in the House working on clean air policy, positions working on biofuels in the Senate, positions in the committee. What I ultimately did was I found a mentor who was willing to serve as my supervisor, who was looking for a fellow that had really 8 years of experience in the Obama White House working on energy and climate change policy. She had just come over to the Senate, and she had some big ideas about what she wanted to do to raise the senator's profile on energy and climate change, and to really advance bipartisan opportunities around climate change mitigation. And so we came with that broadly in mind. We knew the senator was on the Agriculture Committee. We knew that the technologies that I had some expertise on would be something that could be valuable. But I've been able to take on so much more than that during the course of my fellowship. For example, one part of the Farm Bill is the energy title. It's a series of policies that affect biofuels and affect rural energy installations on farms and in rural communities. We hadn't thought at all about the opportunities in the energy title of the Farm Bill, but we were actually able to meet with outside stakeholders, develop these policies. I was able to write the bill text myself. We won endorsements from groups like the Carbon Capture Coalition, American Biogas Council, and we were able to offer a bipartisan amendment for a voice vote during the markup, and able to get policies we weren't even thinking about at the beginning of the year into what is now the Senate Farm Bill, just as one example. So I think there really is an opportunity. I think it's best to choose a fellowship where you have some idea of what you'll be doing and what your general day-to-day will look like, but then have the flexibility to propose your own ideas and take them over the finish line yourself. I think that's the best kind of fellowship you can have.
Thank you, Maryam.
So I think it's been kind of a mix. So when I got started, there were definite projects that needed to get done, and my supervisor at that point didn't know me super well, or my work ethic or anything like that. So the stuff that I started out doing was very much designated from the top. And then as I started to figure out, what is it exactly that National Library of Medicine does, how can my expertise fit into what we're doing, I was able to propose a workshop that we're hosting in September, which was kind of, an idea that I had in grad school when I was dreaming about what a good way to teach data science would look like, or bioinformatics as my background is. And so I had this idea that, there's all these papers that are out there and they get published without the sort of computational methods, the code getting peer reviewed. And so what if we, as a way to teach people about bioinformatics and how to do data analysis, got them to try to reproduce papers that had already been published, and then go through best practices that facilitate what we call reproducibility and open science, so making sure that the underlying data and the analysis is shared publicly. And so we're hosting this workshop that I just kind of dreamed about when I was in grad school at the NIH, which is really awesome and exciting. and we already have plans to do it again next fiscal year. So I think as you start to build a reputation within your host office, you have more flexibility to pose more projects that are, sort of like passion projects or things that you have sort of a vested interest in. So yeah.
All right, great. We have a couple of more questions coming in from the audience. So audience, continue to bring in your questions. Let's see. One is it feasible to do the STPF fellowship during your postdoc fellowship? So no. As an NIH intramural postdoc, for example. So I'm going to say no to that one. STPF is its own full-time opportunity. And so if you want to get a postdoc fellowship, then it's a bit different, but I mean, it's definitely not a postdoc research opportunity. So to answer your question, no, it's a full-time professional development opportunity that's not postdoc related. So
can I answer a specific, so for the NIH postdoc, there are some options to do details in policy offices. So that's very specific to NIH, but do this fellowship.
And one thing to talk about, NIH, so once you become a fellow, there are, fellows are sponsored or, I'm using a different word, fellows are sponsored by different funding mechanisms. And so with folks at NIH, they are, there are sort of like a temp or a Fed temp, so to speak, for a year. So they are federal employees. And so they may be able to share with you what other opportunities there are at NIH, versus, another agency. So that's why Maryam was able to answer that question specifically to NIH. So we have a question from the audience. What is it like being a fellow during the current political atmosphere, and do you feel it? So since you're on the Hill, Daniel, I really am interested to hear your perspective.
So this is always a fun question to answer. I think that politics run the Hill. Every decision is made in a political lens first, and it is impossible to escape that. And it's really one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, why I wanted to be on the Hill, just because it was so foreign and so unique to the kind of training I got during my PhD. I'll say a little bit. I think there is a perception, I think, by folks who are outside of Washington right now, sometimes to feel like there is a continual barrage of news and a barrage of policy changes and a barrage of tweets that make it impossible to be effective. And I would say that my experience has been nothing but farther from that impression. I think you quickly learn in a job like this what is important and what is not important, what are developed policy changes, what are political changes that deserve your attention, and which are ones that are just background noise. And I think it's really essential to have that kind of perspective, to wake up every day and work on something that that does not make Twitter headlines. It's not being covered on MSNBC. It's not being covered on CNN or Fox News. But it is an important part of the policy process. And I have felt no shortage of opportunities to be empowered to take those kinds of things on. I would say I work for a very bipartisan Democratic senator, one who really doesn't try to introduce a bill unless he can find a Republican co-sponsor. I think he did that before there was full Republican control of Congress and the executive branch. But if anything, that has just upped the ante to think more creatively, to reach out, to build alliances. And to take advantage of the relative amount of bipartisan comity that exists in the U.S. Senate, that is pretty different than other branches of government, than other branches of the legislative branch right now.
Maryam?
So I think, I mean, I work at the NIH, which is a very, which enjoys a great deal of bipartisan support and is, again, run mostly by scientists, people with scientific backgrounds. So we are pretty immune to the winds of politics, although something that I did learn since I started at NIH, I know, in academia, I was always kind of annoyed when funding didn't go through or when funding opportunities that I thought would be coming down the pike weren't. And I experienced that frustration along with many of my colleagues. And so I've learned that, part of that is when you don't have a budget that's supposed to come down from Congress when you expect it to, you can't start new programs. You can't fund new projects. And so having that kind of linkage and seeing where NIH falls within this governmental, bureaucratic, but also very political system has been really eye-opening to me. And I think that it's helped me talk to my colleagues that are still, practicing scientists about how important it is for us to be engaged in policy and also do simple things like vote, because it really does have consequences on how we're able to do our jobs. So that's kind of an intentionally oblique answer to that question.
All right, we have a question from an audience member. Did you have a job between PhD and fellowship? Do you think that doing a science-based postdoc before applying to the STPF is advantageous? So I'll let Maryam answer and then Danielle. Or you guys can.
So I defended my PhD research on October 20th and then applied to the fellowship on November 1st. And then continued to close out my PhD projects for a couple of months. And then I really wanted to spend some time pursuing my science communication interests. And so I did a lot of freelance writing. And I also I also do web design. So I did that to kind of pay the bills while I was doing some freelance writing work. So I technically had a job and income, but it certainly is very specific to the unique person that I am and not necessarily something that other people would do. But I do know people who arrange situations where they could do a short-term postdoc if they knew that they wanted to do the fellowship straight out of their PhD.
Danielle?
Sure, I'll hop in really quickly. So there is a requirement for the vast majority of fellowships, including the ones offered by the AAAS, that you need to have a PhD in hand at time of application. And that's a really important thing. So applications are due November 1st. I managed to graduate December of 2015 for my PhD. So I ended up doing about 1 year and 9 months of postdoc before I came to Washington, D.C., in part because I didn't line up perfectly with the kind of the standard schedule. It sounds like Maryam did a much better job with the scheduling. I think that doing a postdoc is a good option. It's not the only option for what you can do. I had the opportunity to kind of tie my PhD thesis in a neat little bow and get all of my papers out. And unfortunately, I started some new research projects that I then tried to finish during my AAAS fellowship. I wouldn't recommend that. And it was, but I could have done anything else, and I think it would have been valuable. I spent some of my time during my during my postdoc volunteering for the Clinton campaign during the 2016 election and doing a mixture of policy and politics work. I think that is something that should be encouraged and something fellows should go out and do. And it's great to hear that not everyone just goes and does a science postdoc.
All right. We have room for 2 more questions, audience members. So if you have questions, please send them here. Let's see. did you guys get, or you guys from the DC area, and how did you guys get acclimated to living in DC, especially where DC is heavy in politics? And so how did you acclimate yourself? So Maryam?
The first thing that popped into my head when you asked that question was, so when we moved here, it was very hot. And I don't have a, you know, coming from academia, I didn't have appropriate clothes to wear to work because they were mostly, you know, torn with bleach stains and things like that. So I don't know why, but I thought of the wardrobe requirements and was going to recommend J. Crew Factory for affordable and business attire. But I think culturally, because this is actually what your question was and not style advice. I think that the fellowship network is really valuable, that we're all coming in at the same time and we have all of these, you know, orientation activities and get to know each other. Because I was coming from New York, where all of my friends were. I was living there for 11 years essentially, and had never really moved from, this is the furthest south that I've ever lived. And so getting to meet friends who had similar interests to mine, figuring out what were the, you know, fun events to go to, and always having somebody to, you know, try out this concert or these outdoor movie events was really useful as I was finding my footing. I also have a front yard for the first time living outside of New York, and so I started leash training my cat to try to hang out there with her. It's been a year and it's not going well.
So I'll just say a little bit. I think Maryam mentioned the great resources that AAAS sets up for the incoming fellows that are not just curricular but also extracurricular. There are affinity groups around all different kinds of issues, from like citizen engagement in democracy to let's go to a museum on Saturday to let's invite someone from the Department of Energy to talk about cybersecurity policy. All different kinds of groups bringing together, what I think is a really wonderful mix and a really wonderfully sized group of smart, passionate, and maybe extrovert is not the quite word, but, you know, broadly societally interested science and engineering PhDs. I will say that I sold my car when I moved here. It was a great decision. It is possible to ride your bike in 4 seasons in Washington, D.C. You need a very heavy coat in the winter and a change of clothes at your workplace in the summer. But it absolutely is possible. You know, no one moves here for the weather or the food or the people, but actually the food and the people are pretty great here. I've been really happy in Washington. It's a fascinating metropolitan area.
Thank you. I'm going to use these 2 minutes to answer questions that maybe you guys can't answer or you guys can help me answer. So one is it difficult to bring a spouse and family to DC when doing the fellowship? As a program manager, I've had fellows bring their family and their spouses, and they have been fine in terms of acclimating into DC. So I don't think that it is difficult at all. However, Daniel and Maryam, have you encountered family fellows or fellows that were on their family, and did they share that it was difficult into DC? So anyone can take that.
I'll just add in briefly that it's absolutely possible. I think the fellows with families tend to live a little farther outside of the city, though not exclusively, and they typically have slightly longer commutes. But you know, DC is a large metropolitan area with an excellent transit system and lots of housing.
Awesome. Is it typical to do the fellowship a few years after earning a PhD? Yes. As long as you have your PhD, you can apply to the fellowships at any point within your career. We have many different fellows enter the fellowship in different stages. We have mid-career folks. We have folks that have retired, folks that have taken sabbaticals. We have early career fellows. So you can, again, apply at any point within your career. Let's see. And then you must be a U.S. citizen in order to apply to the fellowships.
The AAAS Center for Science Diplomacy has a bunch of fellowships listed on their website for international people who are international. So I recommend checking that out.
That's right, and some of the Congressional fellowships also accept international applicants.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see. I think, guys, we are awesome and great because we've covered most questions that are on the chats. Well, good job to us. And now that it is 3:55, just wanted to, do you guys have any parting advice for those that are in the audience thinking about the fellowships and delving into science policy? What advice would you give? So I'll turn this to Danielle.
I would say that if you know in your heart of hearts that you want to get an experience that is outside of kind of traditional research and traditional science and engineering, and if you are passionate about kind of broader societal issues, you should apply. It's, you know, this is a great, varied, diverse, well-known career development opportunity. I meet AAAS fellows everywhere. They call us the AAAS Mafia sometimes. It is a well-trodden, but certainly not an overdone or trite path into these kinds of issues. And I'd recommend anyone who thinks that they have that inclination to at least apply.
Maryam?
So echoing that, I mean, this has been a really phenomenal opportunity for me and for my fellow fellows, as we say. And I think that something that's been extremely useful for me is my background in communication and in storytelling specifically. Every single policy workshop, event, training that I've ever gone to has really emphasized the skill or the art of storytelling as being really essential for pursuing a career in science policy or advocacy, really understanding the ways in which policy decisions impact our work as scientists and as engineers, and being able to communicate that in a personal way, and understanding that our personal connections to the work that we do are really valuable in a career in policy or in advocacy, or even if we try to engage in that in a sort of small scale way. So I think really embrace the personal and get out and start talking to the people around you about, you know, how science and society should work together, kind of as a broad point, and apply for the fellowship.
Awesome. Yes. Well, actually, no, I have 2 more minutes and I have 2 more questions. How many times can you apply to the fellowship? You can apply anytime. So let's say, for example, you apply to the fellowship and you did not move through the application phase 1 year, you can apply the next year until you get through. So you can apply as many times as you can. And then is it possible to renew the fellowship, or is it a 1-year fellowship? So for Congressional, it's only a 1-year fellowship. Actually, all fellowships are a 1-year opportunity. However, with the executive branch, there is an opportunity to renew for a 2nd year, pending budget and pending project, depending on the agency. And all right, so I think I got it. So thank you all. That brings us to our time. I wanted to thank Danielle and Maryam for joining us today and sharing your fellowship experience. And thank you to the audience for joining us and all of your great questions. If we didn't get to your questions today, send us an email at fellowships, FELLOWS. No, excuse me, yep, FELLOW. I think I'm nervous again. So FELLOWSHIP ips@AAAS.org. And plan to join us on July 18th for the next chat in the series, where we'll be talking with fellows on what's it like to be a AAAS policy fellow. So if you kind of missed out on some of our conversation here, our next series will definitely touch base. Visit the fellowship's website to view upcoming chats in the series, and visit the fellowship's website for information and details related to the application process. So thanks again for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.